Jeremy Hunt is set to deliver his first spring statement as Chancellor of the Exchequer this week, accompanied by a full fiscal statement from the Office of Budget Responsibility. With the Prime Minister last week stating that confidence is returning after official figures show that the economy grew by 0.3% in January, what will this week's budget bring? Our panel of experts discuss their predictions in this round table discussion.
The spring budget is just around the corner, and Jeremy Hunt set out his stall quite clearly in the autumn that taming inflation and managing public debt as a proportion of GDP are his priorities. In one of our recent polls, 60% of our respondents agreed that inflation was the number one priority. 53 said that we should be looking at super taxes on energy profits, and 54 thought that we should be reducing income tax. Now, with that as a background, I'm going to ask the panel what they think the changes are going to be that the Chancellor is going to announce. Steve, if I could turn to you first and ask you about your predictions for business taxation.
So what's going to be really interesting to me is what he does about that. Does he recognise that there's concerns about the impact that might have on business investment and do something to address that? I think with the mini budget we had from the previous government, there will be real concerns about making fundamental changes. So probably a change to the corporation tax rate is off the table. What we might see is some tweaking around the edges in terms of encouraging business investment. A possible increase in the annual investment allowance is something to try and, encourage capex, or some other incentives around that are the sort of things I think we might see.
So I think one of the main government incentives for investment is R&D tax reliefs, and we've seen Rishi Sunak talk about how he thinks that that's open to abuse at the moment. So I think it'd be really interesting to see how they approach that, and whether they bring it forward so that you apply for clearance in advance rather than a retrospective claim.
So I think what those large businesses will be expecting is really clarity over that regime, exactly what they need to do with these onerous requirements, how much information they need to report, but also the safe harbours that they can rely on in terms of, where they are in jurisdictions where there shouldn't really be an issue. Can they, rely on there being a reduced reporting regime for those type of territories?
There's concern out there about the dwindling workforce, particularly amongst the over 50s, those people who left during the COVID period and really haven't rejoined the workforce, and the impact that has on UK productivity. And you couple that with inflation and the impact on the cost of living for everybody. Ian, do you think there's going to be changes in the employment taxes arena to try and encourage people to come back to work?
Great question, Andrew. I think for me, we talked a bit about at the start, the poll saying people wanted to cut in income taxes. What we might see is some change to the pension rules there. We've got a lot of people, like you said, that are closer to retirement age, let's say, who may have given up work, and this may be because they can't put any more in their pension. So we may well see annual allowances being looked at here as an incentive to get people back into the workforce. I mean, we've seen lots of areas here where organisations are struggling to fulfil roles at all levels, be it people who are earning close to the national minimum wage to people earning more extensive salaries, and that will help people get back into work, as will potentially areas where we can see easements around immigration and right to work aspects as well. So there's different things to just the income tax cuts that could happen. I've been talking to a couple of clients today and yesterday in relation to other benefits and reward areas that the government could also look at here. That could be looking at how they could ease certain salary sacrifice arrangements, but also looking at skills and training too. So how the apprenticeship levy is used, that's come under a little bit of fire recently. They could make it more flexible for organisations to look at, and also make sure they can spend the money, because a lot of it gets unspent and then it goes into the government's coffers, never to be seen again by the businesses who could actually use it wisely to get more people trained up to do better jobs.
So we've heard from the panel about what they think the changes are going to be. Perhaps the hardest question, and John, I'm going to direct this to you to start with. What do you think is not going to change? What do you think is going to stay the same?
So thanks for that one, Andrew. That's a really difficult one. Some famous last words here, but I think I'm going to be the first tax advisor in history to predict that the capital gains tax and the entrepreneurs relief, or business asset disposal relief as it's now known, isn't going to change. I think it's unlikely that we're going to see any changes around inheritance taxes, but we might see some consultations about some long-term changes in those areas.
I think for me, we saw lots of noise around IR35 under Liz Truss. I think it's going to be quiet for that. The area where we could see some developments is umbrellas, but I think they'll leave IR35 alone for this budget on the basis that it was announced in April 21 that it was brought in for the medium to large businesses. I think that'll stay.
Yeah, things not changing can be both good and bad for the taxpayer. So a good thing will be if the energy price cap stays for another 3 months, as has been widely trailed. That will help us all out from a domestic perspective. The bad thing, which just slowly creeps up on everyone all the time, is the freezing of all thresholds and boundaries for all rates and allowances, and that's across a huge spectrum of taxes. You know, that creates what's, you know, we all know as fiscal drag. So it all catches up on us, especially in a period of high inflation, such that we all get dragged into higher tax brackets, whether that be individuals, businesses, business gifts. There's a whole spectrum of things that applies to. So again, I expect that all those rates and thresholds to remain the same.
I think over the last 18 months, we saw lots of announcements, lots happening in 2022, especially with the different prime ministers we had, and then a raft of different budgets. So I think this year we'll hopefully won't see as many. It'll be a bit calmer. The seas won't be as choppy as the government look to take some of the heat out of the situation, and also try and get people, you know, working again, trying to make sure they can manage inflation and they can bring things under control after a difficult last 12 months.
And finally, Steve first, what would you love to see the Chancellor do?
Yeah, two things from me that I'd like to see. On the personal tax side, I'd like to see some of the unfairness withdrawn. So that's where we've got cliff edges, where child benefit gets withdrawn, where personal allowance gets withdrawn, or your ability to get childcare vouchers gets withdrawn. I think they are cliff edges, and it'd be good to see them withdrawn. And then from the business side, I think what everyone is crying out for is stability in the tax regime. You know, a long-term commitment to us knowing, or investors knowing, what the UK tax regime will look like for businesses. So I'd love to see that.
I think what I'd like to see, Andrew, is more targeted relief for investment, especially in startups and tech. I know we've already got the EIS and the VCT reliefs available to people, but I'd like to see those broadened out and made a bit more generous.
I would love to see better clarity, personally. We see some cases, particularly in employment taxes, where there's just not a lot of clarity. Everything's in the legislation and people don't know what they're doing. I've seen it today with whether a vehicle is a van or a car, for instance. It'd be great to get better clarity on some areas of tax and make sure that the government can consult with the right people as well there. I would also quite like to see more in the way of how we can encourage the labour force to be enhanced over here. So that might be a case of making sure they can make some immigration reliefs, they can get some hybrid working models for global mobility purposes that are more effective for the UK. I think for me, Andrew, the other thing to think about here is generosity. What we've seen is there's lots of things related to tax and getting people back to work, but there's been a problem with social mobility in the UK, and it's trying to encourage people to be able to work in places, travel to cities, travel to towns to make sure they can get back to work and also get the right skills. So there may well be some need for some easements around tax reliefs for travelling on public transport, increasing allowances for business mileage and things like that too. That would really help individuals get different types of experiences, different types of work, and also encourage employers to cast their net more widely for people who might be looking for work as well.